strangle this thing. It needs to be about 12 inches longer so I can get a little flexibility, but it isn't. Well, let's try it this way, and if it's too uncomfortable, I'm going to go down there and talk louder. We'll see how it goes. It's a pleasure to be back again, and we've got three sessions coming up actually on William Faulkner. Mrs. McElroy called last spring and said, well, what do we want to do? Do you want to do something? And I said, sure. And she had said that several of you had suggested that we try to tackle Faulkner sometime in the near future. And she suggested Absalom, which struck me as a good choice. It seems to me if you're going to do a writer like Faulkner, who I would put probably number 1 or number 2 on the list of writers from this century who will be read for a long, long time, you might as well go right to the novel which is perhaps his most sophisticated and maybe his most difficult. It's a book. It's one of those books which I know from experience by students. A lot of people read or try to read and then don't finish because it demands so much more of you than his more traditional narratives. You want to call it that. When people ask me what I think about Faulkner and why I think he's good, I try to justify my admiration for him, not simply in terms of the fact that he can write a good story or write a good novel, but that Faulkner goes one step beyond what many other writers who are very good do, and that is he successfully creates an entire world and interrelates that world, the people in his books, with each other and with us, so that when we face the self of Faulkner, we're coming to terms with somebody who is giving us, in a way that very few writers do, a sense that we're getting a window into something much larger than what we're seeing. And those of you who remember Faulkner from college and maybe got into reading him know that anytime you read a Faulkner novel, you know there may be another novel that will expand and clarify and push on and make more of the people you meet. Nobody in Faulkner seems to stand all by himself. I think that's one of the traits that really separates him from everybody else. He did not write 20 separate books. He wrote books which speak to each other. And that's exceptionally attractive. I was trying to think this morning as I was pondering how to go about it this afternoon that there's sort of a coincidence for me here because at 11:30 I was introducing my third period class to the Partner's Tale. We spent half the class on the Franklin's Tale, and I was telling them what a nice marriage Dorigen had. And then we moved to the Partner's Tale, and it reminded me that the great achievement of Chaucer, for me, is that you know he's giving you little glimpses of an entire society. You know what it was like to be alive in 1375. And if he chooses by some inadvertence not to expand on one of the characters, if you don't know much more about the cook than a few lines, and you know that he could have if he had wanted to, couldn't he? And usually when I come here, I think it's a terrific psychic shock for me to be talking Middle English at 11:30 and incomprehensible 20th century English at 1. But in fact, there are connections, and Chaucer has that ability. He has another ability. Did I say Chaucer? Yeah. Faulkner has that ability. He has another ability, and that is to make his parochial interest and background pertinent to all of us. America has always suffered as a literature by the tendency on the part of its writers to focus in its, we call it local color in 1880, but to focus on an area. And the writers who don't succeed are those who fail to make their local area pertinent to all of us. And that's why local color as a phenomenon in American literature is second rate, right? They never go beyond New England, right? Upper Midwest, California. The great writers know that to be writing great literature, it has to speak to us 600 years later as thoroughly and as convincingly as it does when it was written. And it can't speak only to a parochial audience. That's one of the great distinctions of greatness. That's why Chaucer is still a great writer. I can talk about the prologue to the Franklin's Tale, and the Franklin says in there to the squire, if my son were like yours, I would give 20 pounds worth of land to have a son who tried to be as gentlemanly as you. But my son, he hangs around with pages, right, jerks, in other words, doesn't have anything to do with company that would teach him gentility, and spends all his money gambling and playing dice. Right? And so I tell that to my seniors, and I say, have you ever heard a father say, I don't like the company you keep? Nothing has changed. I mean, Faulkner, Chaucer is still as pertinent now as he was in 1375. That's where you get Faulkner. I think Faulkner deals at the most intense level of tragedy. That's another indication of greatness. King Lear is greater than Measure for Measure. He deals in an area he knew well, and he creates it well in his literature, and he makes it pertinent to us. That is the horrendous, might even say melodramatic experiences of Absalom. Speak to us today. It's not a Southern novel, it's a human novel. And it is a book also which, since it's so very hard to read by yourself, especially if you're used to reading contemporary narrative fiction, it's a book which has to be taught. And so I thought I would try to take it as a challenge to convince you that it's worth spending the time, if you find him difficult, to push through it, to get into his mode of expressing this curious world, which in many cases is sort of stream of consciousness and violates your expectations, but which, when you go with him and he's on, is well worth the effort. I told a colleague this morning before school that I was doing this, and he said he remembered an English professor of his at college saying, the only way you could ever come to terms with Faulkner is to listen to him being read to you by a middle-aged man who has already had several brandies and is sitting in front of the fireplace late at night. Well, I've had 2 Dubonnays, and I'm on the verge of middle age, if I can call it that. And but it's not late at night, and you don't have a fireplace, so we have to do our best without those 2 elements. But it reminded me of something I intended to speak to you immediately, and that is that, like a lot of great writers who are tough, did I break this? Tough going when you read them alone. Henry James being another one, by the way. Reading them out loud is a most rewarding experience. One of my biggest surprises as a teacher was how wonderfully Henry James reads out loud. And this is also true of Faulkner. And I hope this afternoon that we'll have time that I may use the second portion of this afternoon to read with you and through the entire first chapter of Absalom. At least that's one of my goals. And then urge you to go on to read and next week pick up farther as we get into the mode of Faulkner's fiction. So the challenge is, how do we make this book accessible to us? And I think the first thing we have to do is recognize that Faulkner is a creative genius, and he chooses not, in all of his fiction, to tell us a straightforward story, as much as we would like it. So when we pick up something like Sanctuary, we read Faulkner, it's a straightforward novel of setting, insulting in some ways, powerful, but nobody has a difficulty reading that novel, right? I mean, it's just a book. Good. Well, as he evolved, he decided that normal narrative sequencing, the natural syntax of the historical language, wasn't sufficient. Didn't satisfy his need to express the narrow particularity of his experience. This is a reminder to me also of what Henry James did, that if you read the late James aloud, you come across, as you do with Faulkner, those long sentences, maybe half a page long, and reading them quietly in your head, you say, what in the world is this man doing? And reading them aloud, you realize that what he's doing is refining the meaning. James had the sense that a simple statement of fact wasn't enough, and that he wanted you to know exactly in the interior of your head the crucial refinement of the emotion he's trying to express. The feeling is almost as though language didn't suffice of its own accord, and it demands something else. I think this is a lot of what, for me, makes Faulkner interesting. I thought I'd start off today by reading a sentence with you, and maybe helping you to be willing to let him speak to you in this kind of curious way, which is so frustrating so often. Look to page 32 in your text. And we'll just use this as a way of beginning the book. Also, of course, raise your hands. This is a class. I feel more like I'm in a public lecture in this room than upstairs, but don't hesitate to ask a question if you're missing something here. 32. I came across this when I was reading, and I thought, wow, what a great Faulkner sentence to start off with, to get a sense of why he's so hard to read. This is a description of what Thomas Sutpen appeared to be like when he first came into town. Remember, if you've read far enough into it, he came out of nowhere into this provincial town, almost a village, I think you'd say, Mississippi, a stranger driving a pack of half-wild slaves and a French architect, which is a nice combination. Faulkner has a tremendous sense of humor, by the way, too, which people miss sometimes because it's so embedded in seriousness. But this is what he looked like. In normal syntax, you'd say, well, he looked like this. But Faulkner says he looked like this, about 6 lines down in the second paragraph there. He looked like a man who had been sick. Okay. That's enough for most of us, isn't it? We would say it looks like a man recovering, he looked weak. The phrase, the simile holds up pretty well, but not enough. And so he wants to refine the particular nature of recovery that Faulkner is going through. Not like a man who had been peacefully ill in bed and had recovered to move with a sort of diffident and tentative amazement in a world which he had believed himself on the point of surrendering. Okay. That's not what he looked like. In case the simile, he looked like a man who had been sick, brings that image to mind. Faulkner doesn't want you to think about that, like somebody who's, well, I'm still alive, goodness gracious, I thought I was giving up and I'm passing on. No, he looked like a different kind of man. But he looked like a man who had been through some solitary furnace experience which was more than just fever. Like an explorer, say, who not only had to face the normal hardship of the pursuit which he chose, but was overtaken by the added and unforeseen handicap of the fever also, and fought through it at enormous cost, not so much physical as mental, alone and unaided, and not through blind instinctive will to endure and survive, but to gain and keep, and to enjoy it the material prize for which he accepted the original gambit. Now, all that is, it's half a page practically, and all it is an extension of what he looked like, a man who had been sick. And inside that sentence are all kinds of layers of meaning that refine for us what Thomas Sutpen had gone through. And the mystery of the novel is, well, what in the heck went on with these people, right? I mean, it's told so indirectly. Why did they leave that Christmas Eve, right? Why did the son kill Charles Bond? What is the meaning behind all of this? You go back to the sentence and you can cut out a lot of supplemental material and you get something like this. He looked like a man who had been sick, like an explorer who was overtaken by the fever, right, and fought through it alone and unaided to gain the material prize for which he had accepted the original gambit. Now you see, get rid of all that other stuff, we catch a couple of features involved. To accept a gambit is to accept a challenge, right? I mean, a certain sequence of events which is sort of predetermined. It's a chess word, isn't it? And so an opening gambit is a sequence of plays which is predetermined. And the implication is that Thomas Sutpen had gone out into the world as an explorer would, expecting to follow a certain series of steps and therefore come to a certain conclusion. And we know what the conclusion is, isn't it going to be? The conclusion is going to be the establishment of a family, right? He's going to make himself a southern gentleman, build himself a southern mansion, and buy himself some good property, 1,000 acres with his slaves. And through the force of his will, marry a respectable southern woman. Not that he doesn't love her, but that's what you do, isn't it? That part of what you catch in the novel is that Thomas Sutpen is a man who has all the external concepts or understandings of how you make a family. Right? You have land, you have a building, you marry into the right family, you produce children, and then you create a lineage. And then everybody respects you, don't they? And if they respect you enough, they'll never send you away from the back door of a house again. I mean, money will do it. Right? Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Right? Provide. And Sutpen understands that early on, that his willpower is strong enough to do that. But what doesn't he expect? See, he doesn't understand that once he goes on this exploration, he's going to get sick. It's not enough. Fever is going to hit him, and it's going to bring him to the very edge of his life. So here in this very early paragraph, you catch the subtlety of really the meaning of the story. Sutpen never had what you need for happiness. He thought he did. He thought it was willpower, and that domination would do it, but he doesn't have it at all. And it's going to crumble and be destroyed because the man doesn't understand people at all, their needs, the context in which they live. what they desire as human beings. He's a great failure. And in his failure, you get that tragic element, right? What kind of a man is he? Well, like, I'll never be satisfied with this thing. like a hero out of Shakespeare. He creates his own greatness. And one of the great rules of tragedy is that you should be, at the end, awestruck at what you've seen. There are very few people like Macbeth. And it's because he had the potential to be so great that you are so stunned by his fall. And Thomas Sutpen, if this story is written well, should leave us with that same emotion. Obviously, this man could have done anything. But he had the flaw, didn't he? And that's where tragedy lies. And this is why you read a book like this and you catch that there are really generations and centuries of pain involved in the representation of this single character, who we call Thomas Sutpen. When I used to teach this, as I occasionally did at the U, and the reason I was willing to teach it to you was that I had enough nerve when I was a young man to try to teach it to sophomores. I remember sitting in there trying to explain this book to these 19-year-old kids. Now that I teach high school, I'm more aware of where they were coming from and how stupid I was to try it, but I did anyway. Absalom, Absalom. One of the first questions I would ask them is, well, there's nobody in this book called Absalom, right? What does it mean? And look at the title. The kids never look at words these days. It's got an exclamation point at the end. Does anybody know who Absalom was? And of course, I never find anybody who knew anything about it unless they came from Eastside Catholic High School, and they might. Absalom is the son of David. And the words of the title are the words of David when his son has turned traitor to him and then been killed by David's own aid. And in spite of the fact that his son is a traitor and trying to overthrow him, Absalom feels the loss of his son. And this is David's cry of woe. Absalom, Absalom, my son, Absalom. What did his friend think? I mean, his aide, his assistant thought, well, why aren't you giving me a Victoria Cross, right? I've preserved your throne. But he hadn't. He'd taken his son. And Absalom wanted his son alive as a traitor, not his son dead as a powerful king. This is a story about family then, and the first words you see tell you that. That's why Faulkner chose the title. It's about what happens to a man who tries to create a family and doesn't understand the relationship between men and women, and certainly doesn't understand the relationship between fathers and sons, because he has had the crudeness? No, that's not right. The imperception to understand that the son he's going to lose is not just the son he has from the nice, white, gentle lady of Mississippi. He's going to lose another son who also demanded something from him, and he chose not to give it. And if you've read far enough, you know. Now I ask myself, do I dare tell him something about the plot? That he's going to lose Charles Bond, who is also his son. He thought he could pick and choose. Right? This white son is mine. This son here who has some black blood is not mine. And that fate wouldn't enter into this tremendous sin of pride. Tremendous sin of pride that he had. So, here we are, beginning to talk about the book, and I think, how do I approach it? And I think what I would like to do, with your permission, is to start by getting at some material that in an ordinary reading experience you probably would not want to know. Because the experience of reading this novel is a retelling over and over through various people's eyes what Thomas Sutpen did. Right? And when you pick up, if you've read like the first chapter alone, you know you get an angle of vision. Rosa Coldfield is telling Quentin Compson about what happened. Right? She has a perfectly clear image. The devil came to town, didn't he? He came to town in the guise and the appearance of Thomas Sutpen, and totally unprepared, he came to our house, took my sister away, and destroyed my family. Rosa Coldfield, who is an old, really dying, shortly to die, bitter spinster, who had been horribly insulted by this man at one time. What's the insult? We don't know yet. Right? But she knows what she thinks. Thomas Sutpen was not a man. Right? He was the devil. He was the devil. Can I let a wandering thought through my mouth as well as my head? I urge you, as soon as possible, to go see Amadeus at the Guild 45th Theater. Because if Thomas Sutpen is the devil, Mozart is God's joke on humankind. He chooses the most ridiculous person in the world to make his immediate funnel into beauty. That's what went through my head as I was talking about Thomas Sutpen. Salieri's, in that movie, Salieri's great objection is that God didn't choose an appropriate tool for his beauty. He chose this jerk. Well, God does that, doesn't he? And in case, getting back to the point, Thomas Sutpen for Rosa is the devil. In the second chapter, Quentin Compson is talking to us through remembering his conversation with his father. Right? And Mr. Compson, he has some knowledge, which Rosa Coldfield did not have. And the first thing you catch in this novel is that nobody's going to tell you exactly what happened. What they're going to do is give you their versions of what happened based upon whatever percentage of ignorance they have. And if they've got money on the game, like Rosa, they know what they think happened. If they don't, they're more speculative, more doubtful, like Mr. Compson, and they give you another angle of vision. And the frustration for readers who don't want to do this is that you and I often, as readers, want the narrative. I wish this darn writer would tell me what to think. And Faulkner says no, because truth is many-sided, and it depends on who's telling the story, doesn't it? And that brings us back to the first point. The only reason you want to read the story is to understand what happened to Quentin Compson. Right? You've read Sound and Fury. You know Quentin Compson's story. You've read other Faulkner pieces, and you know that Quentin committed suicide in his first year at Yale. Harvard. Is he Harvard or Yale? Harvard. And much of Faulkner's fiction focuses on the Compson family, and there are a lot of good reasons in the Compson family for him to be upset, if you've read Sound and the Fury, among other things. But the reason he commits suicide is here. This is his story as he sits in his dormitory with his roommate, his buddy, Shreve, who doesn't understand the South at all. And Shreve is eliciting these memories of the South and saying, well, tell me about the South. I mean, what's it like? And Quentin says, well, all I can do is tell you about this man. This is the South. And after he's finished it, he kills himself, doesn't he? Because he has come to terms with something he cannot handle. And the combination of Sound and the Fury and Absalom is the pressure that brings this young man who has such a wonderful future. Obviously, he's sensitive, intelligent, kind. There's everything good about him. He can't survive. So how do I approach it with you? My desire is to start at the beginning with genealogy and tell you some things that come out as revelations as the story goes on, so that we can see who's related to whom. And if I could do that, would you mind? And then you'll have if you're reading along with me, you'll have somewhat of an angle of vision to expect certain things that should be surprises to you. But take my word for it, one of the rules of literature is not supposed to be read only once. Right? Students in high school think that a poem is like a piece of chocolate. Once you've eaten it, it's all over. And if you talk about it, you ruin it for them. And no. If it's any good, it gets better the second time you read it. It's one of the few things in life that is. I'm going to use the blackboard to put some of this on so we can take a look at it. If you will turn to the back of your book, if you have the same edition I do, you see a genealogy. You see that on page 381. Does everybody have it? Okay, let's take a look at this and put some lines on the board.
I think I put it in the back of the book so that people don't discover it, because a lot of evidence is here in terms of what you should be discovering as you go on to read. Obviously, right, the kingpin here is Thomas Sutpen, the man who comes into Jefferson with these wild slaves and French architect and buys enough property to establish a line, lineage, a big beautiful house in Southern tradition. Where had he come from and where was he going? Okay, there's Thomas Sutpen, born in West Virginia, right? One of several children. We learn all of this indirectly, don't we? This story goes on. Scotch-English stock. Married twice. Okay. Came to Sutpen's 100 in Yoknapatawpha in 1833. He first married Eulalia Bond. Okay. And in that marriage, he had a son. The son is the man who appears in this novel when he shouldn't appear, right? He's called Charles Bond. Eulalia was born in Haiti, only child of a Haitian sugar planter of French descent. Married Sutpen in 27, divorced him in 31, died in New Orleans. She is not a character in the novel except in reference. But they had a child, son of Thomas and Eulalia, only child, attended University of Mississippi where he met Henry Sutpen and became engaged to Judith. Obviously, if Judith is Sutpen's daughter, what do you have going on here? Yeah, there's a possibility of incest, and of course the great conflict which is at the core of Charles and Henry's antagonism at Christmas, and is why Henry kills Charles, is that Henry cannot allow his sister to marry their half-brother, acceptable to them. And that is not told to us. That is not told to us until well on in the novel, long after we've known the circumstances of Charles Bond's death, where he simply shot out of his saddle like a game of the plantation. Henry does not want to kill Charles, does he? No, of course not. He likes him. In fact, he admires him immensely. But Charles is absolutely driven by a need. Does anybody know read far enough to know what the need is? What is it?
Need to be acknowledged.
Yeah. He'll do anything, including this, which is to assault the highest sensibilities of the white ruling class of Mississippi. His father is to acknowledge him. But Thomas Sutpen cannot acknowledge him. Why? Because he's part black. And everything in this book revolves around the consequences of race and racial relations and the way whites treated blacks in Mississippi in the 19th century. If you know Faulkner, you know that this is the motivation for the guilt behind the sins of the South for centuries. And Faulkner is primarily interested in the consequences of what the South must live through because of what it did to the blacks, and moreover because of what it did to the Indians, in a similar fashion. So yes, he made a mistake as a young man. He was 20 years old, he married a woman who is partially black. She's a Haitian, but not entirely black. Their son, well, his mistress is an octoroon, remember, yeah. They produce a child which is, we could say probably no more than a quarter black, if that. And certainly in appearance is not black at all, true? Because if he were, could possibly have affianced himself to Judith. But what's the rule in the South in 1840? If you have any black blood, 1 drop taints the barrel. Right? So one ounce. He has an octoroon mistress, which means that she is 1/8. He has a child who is, or depending on how much he has, no more than 1/8 black, and that is enough to condemn any human being in the South to slavery before Civil War. A thought which all by itself simply boggles our mind. I urge you to read Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson if you want to see what this does for Mark Twain and the sort of ridiculous extensions of the absurdity of slavery. But any black blood was enough to taint him. Okay, on the other hand, we've got the Coalfield family. Goodhue Coalfield, and who had 2 children. Right? One of them is Ellen, and Ellen becomes Mrs. Thomas Sutpen to produce the children he desires. And on the other hand, he and his mystery wife have Rosa, right, who is going to die unmarried. Thomas Sutpen abandons his child, goes to Mississippi where he is unknown, and sets out to create his lineage, right, his great line. Can you all hear me, by the way? Okay. Thomas Sutpen and Ellen Coalfield produce what children? Okay. You've got Henry, right? And you've got Judith. Anything else that belongs on this line? Clytemnestra. Yeah. But that's not Thomas Sutpen and Ellen. That's Thomas Sutpen and who knows? One of the slaves. No, that's somebody else. You're one step ahead of me. So Thomas Sutpen and X, right? The lines crossing it mean it's illegitimate. Produce Clytemnestra, called Clytie, who is half black and half white. Thomas Sutpen and who? Millie. Is that her name? And Millie, who is Wash Jones's daughter, he's down at the bottom of the white social scale, produce a baby, a girl, unfortunately, and the fact that it's a girl is going to be the immediate cause of his own death. Yeah. So something you catch immediately as soon as you put it on any kind of genealogical chart is that Thomas Sutpen, where it comes to women, has absolutely no morals whatsoever. True? I mean, he may desire to represent white aristocracy in Jefferson, Mississippi, but he will sleep with any woman who appeals to him for his purposes. I wouldn't say he has any passion either, certainly not love. But he will marry or sleep with whoever is available to fit his needs. Now, he marries his first wife when he's too young to understand the consequences, isn't it? The curious, does anybody know what the curious oddity of Thomas Sutpen's childhood is in terms of race?
His parents were worldwide.
Yeah, and from what part of the world? And so what did race mean to them? Right, I mean, he is not a natural Southerner. He never was raised to believe that blacks were inherently property and nothing more. So he never got that quality into his head. That's the reason for this mistake, isn't it? As he mulls over what he wants to do with his life, he marries the wrong woman. And everybody knows you marry the wrong woman, you're destroyed. They can do you in. So he gets out of that. He moves on. But why does he marry wrong one? Ellen Coldfield.
She's very respected.
Okay, get money?
No.
No. Would a woman with money marry him?
No.
No, but she comes from a family which is
Respected.
purest, white, southern, genteel stock. What is her father, by the way?
He's a storekeeper.
Yeah. Is he southern Southern
No.
in temperament?
No.
No. What's wrong with him?
It's not.
How southern is he? They don't have any land, no. He's a storekeeper.
And he doesn't, he freed his slaves.
Yeah, he gets rid of his slaves. But is he extremely interesting in his, I'm trying to think of the word, idiosyncrasy of his personality?
Yeah.
When other people are running off and joining the regiment, what does he do? He goes up in the attic. Yeah, for me that's a very southern thing to do. But yeah, he's a unique person, but unexceptionable in his bloodline, right?
Did you say that's
I think he's given to us as kind of a southern oddball.
No, but you would have joined the Yankee Army if you could have.
Yeah, but I think the point is that in the context of Southern society, there's always in Faulkner room for these people who are really, we would call them unbalanced. Right? Emily, in The Rose for Emily, is one of those people who are a little bit strange. And Southern society has always had them and kept them. And so even though he's clearly a traitor by traditional Southern standards of loyalty, what would the South say about it? Well, old Goodhue always was infected in his brain, yeah. And they would take care of that type of person, wouldn't they? In this case, they make sure that he gets his the aunt, right? Isn't it the aunt that the daughter? The aunt has run away. She's run through the window. Yeah. All these people who ought to have their own novels, right? you wish you knew more about them. And then he goes on, and clearly his morals in terms of his slaves are totally unacceptable to us. And why does he have this baby by Millie?
He wants another son.
He wants to start over again.
His last chance.
His last chance. He never gives up his vision. This is not being any clearer, is it? Is it helping?
Yes.
Think about it a little bit. So we go on. We've got Rosa Coldfield, Henry Sutpen then. Okay, Henry's born 1839.
Could I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
Were Ellen and Rosa half-sisters?
No,
They were sisters.
Because he married twice, we never hear about the one, and the mother died in childbirth with Rosa. We never hear more about her.
You mean Goodhue?
Yes, Rosa
Yeah.
Goodhue.
Well, they're full sisters, I believe.
She's just
Yeah.
much bigger in life.
Yeah. The point is,
but
she's
he-
very, very.
He had two wives. Not Goodhue.
Yeah, Thomas Sutpen had two
Somewhere in
wives.
here I thought
But
I
not
read that
Goodhue.
he had married twice. But it doesn't say anything about Rosa's mother,
Yeah.
except that she died
No,
at
neither-
Rosa's birth, and
yeah.
they never says a word about Ellen's mother.
It's the same one.
I think it's the same person. Neither of Goodhue's wives is of any importance here. What's the crucial point? Well, you hit on it right there. The crucial point for the structure of the novel is
It's
what?
the age difference.
Yeah. How much difference is there between Ellen and Rosa?
Rosa is 4 years younger than Judith.
Right. Okay. So here's Rosa is alive in structure of the first chapter is to present us her memory of her standing at the deathbed of her sister, and her sister saying, protect who? I mean,
Judith,
protect her niece and nephew who happen to be considerably older. This is her family responsibility, and this is what's been driving her crazy for 50 years apparently. Protect who from whom? We'll talk about that in a minute too as we look at it. Yeah, so there's Henry, and then there's Judith. Judith Sutpen, daughter of Thomas and Ellen, born 1841, engaged to Charles Bond in 1860. Okay. Charles Bond, who has come into their family through his friendship with her brother Henry and Judith do not know that Charles Bond has accepted that familiarity because he is his son.
Charles knew that.
Yes, Charles knew that.
He knew that that was his father.
But
He's out to
Henry
get-
didn't know.
Henry did not.
Did he know that was his half-sister?
And so what's he doing? Why is that Christmas Eve visit so horribly disastrous?
Okay,
He goes, but why does he? Remember, he comes and visits just before the war starts. He comes, gets a fiance, and then he disappears. He and Henry go off together, essentially, overnight. And one of the points Faulkner makes is that Judith and her fiancé had
Hardly seen each
hardly
other.
saw each other, yeah. But what's he doing? And why is that so disastrous? He goes to his father, essentially, doesn't he? And he says, unless you openly accept me as your son, I'm marrying your daughter. Right?
Oh, he did.
Yeah.
I thought that, Thomas Sutpen went down to New Orleans to investigate, to find out. if
He did do
Charles-
that, yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, I see.
He went down to do it. But of course, he had lost fatherly responsibilities and rights. He had abandoned his child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was taking care of them.
It sounds as though he was in a way, in terms of financial way,
Financially,
yeah,
yes.
helping them out.
Well, he gave everything up when he had Nancy.
He abandoned everything he had learned and essentially settled it on his wife and the child and thought that that would suffice. One of the wonderful things about him is his will, right? I choose to start over. Here, you take the property and leave me alone. And he no longer was the father. No. I mean, God doesn't structure the world to allow you to say, I'm done being a father. And that's what Charles Bond is trying to say. You may have given me and he did start with nothing. I mean, goodness, you have to have admiration for his willpower, don't you? I mean, that he could just, the sense of a man who could simply look at you and then trap you. I mean, nothing kept that French architect there except his willpower, right? You're going to build my house. And there he was. And just as though, and his constant challenging, his wrestling in the naked with these men, right? Willing to take on anything to show that he's in charge. But he's not in charge. He has put into motion human consequences which will destroy him. He's going to be killed in this novel, and he's going to deserve it. I don't have much love for Wash Jones. I don't think you do either. But Wash Jones' outrage is a human outrage, right? And how dare he say what he just said? Anybody read far enough to remember what that was? No, don't say it. Right? The baby is born, and he says something so offensive, right, to the human sensibility of even this low person that he's killed. And it serves him right. Yeah. So there's.
That Christmas Eve,
Yeah.
Thomas Sutpen told Henry, he told him that Charles was already married. He didn't tell him he was his son, but he told him he was already married. Is that it? Did I tell you that?
Some we get only
Some
through inference.
conversation in
Yeah.
libraries.
What we do know is that it's clear enough to Henry that he's got to get Charles out of there, because if he doesn't, he'll kill him. Right? And so what?
The father will kill him.
No, Henry
himself.
will kill him. Henry is so close to Judith, he will not allow this to happen. So what is the Civil War in the context of Henry's perception of what's going on in their life? Yes, it is an opportunity, if not a way out, at least a temporary postponement of a decision. His hope, and it's pretty clear in the novel, his hope is that these two men can join together, and they do, and work together. They apparently are very close. There's even a strong implication of homosexual, erotic, not necessarily literal, but certainly an erotic attraction going on. He loves Charles Bond. And part of the cruelty of fate is that Charles Bond is an exceedingly handsome, sophisticated, attractive man. He's a New Orleans gentleman, after all, regardless of his Fort Dry blood. And Henry simply says, maybe, we'll read this next week, I think, maybe fate may Does it? No. No, I mean, God structures things too in such a way that you have to take a stand. And so he doesn't do anything about it until they return. The war's over. They're at the gate of the 100, aren't they? And the time has come. When he says you're not going in, and Charles says, I am going in. So, truth is there. Which Charles accepts too, doesn't he? As an acceptable solution.
Why is there such a way of Henry's telling Charles that he should break up the marriage that he has to
To the octoroon.
Yeah.
Now, what's the problem there? We'll talk about that next week as well. It's a really important issue.
Well, they make so much of it, and
Is he married to the octoroon?
Yeah.
I think the phrase that I'm trying to recall now exactly. I think Faulkner calls it a form of marriage,
Yeah.
doesn't he? Calls it a form of marriage. What does that mean?
It's not illegal.
Yeah, sure. It's not a real marriage because she's not. And here again, here's a woman who is considerably classier than anybody else you're going to encounter in this novel, isn't she? She is, by white standards, a kept woman, isn't she? A courtesan. Not uncommon in Louisiana. She's a woman who is 1/8 white. She is as white as any person in this room, isn't she? In appearance.
1/8 black.
Did I say 1/8 white? Yeah, she's 1/8 black. But because she's 1/8 black, her only options for comfort are options that are related to the fact that she is not a white woman. And that makes it possible for her to be in the situation she's in. The indications are that she's a highly sophisticated and educated woman when she comes to the grave. Remember, her and her child are both people of considerable poise. But the point is, Charles Bond has, right? He has married the octoroon, and the issue in the white South is that it's irrelevant if you're married to an octoroon. No matter what you call it, it's only a form. And Charles Bond takes the standards of his father, doesn't he? And disregards that bond, right? He disregards that bond because he chooses to go and make this engagement with his sister. And of course, it's a major issue.
But are you saying that Henry knew that Charles Bond was his half-brother before they went away?
I think he did.
I haven't gotten that impression. I thought that you only got the impression.
I think it's something that is, well, maybe we should, what does he know? Okay. As you read the novel, you get a variety of reasons for what happened. And one of the reasons you get is Henry would not allow a part black man to marry his sister. Right? I mean, this is racial entirely. And that's given to us in a very convincing fashion. I can't recall if it's Mr. Thompson, I think might be the one who uses that as the nice thing about it is that it certainly suffices. But
I thought it was not good because he went down there and he was amazed at the situation.
well,
He went down there.
and of course, I mean, this man to marry my sister, this man who has gone through a form of marriage with an octoroon. The implication is that it's all racial. But I don't believe it for a minute. I think that's on the surface. I think this is a case for me where you're dealing with levels of perception. And he wants to believe only as much as he has to believe. It's enough to believe that Charles is part black to make the married life possible. The reality is so much worse. This is like the moment his husband is going around, and Landers says she knows as much as she wants to know. Right? Don't get involved. And I think that Henry's in that case. The point is that Charles will not let him suffice with the racial inclination. Charles' whole goal here is to say, you're accepting me as your son, and I'm part black. And he's not going to let any of the Sutpens get away with it, even Henry. It's an interesting problem. But I think the question you're asking is one where we as readers have to come to our own judgment, because Faulkner refuses to give you a simple statement of fact. He doesn't give you these interpretations instead.
I thought that the Christmas Eve that Thomas told Henry that Charles was his brother, and that was the reason. And then during the war, Henry kept arguing and talking about Frenchman a long time ago who married his sister, and he kept saying it can be all right, and he was reconciling himself to incest. And then when he
Couldn't do it.
and Charles were driving back, he said, "Oh, it's not incest. It's miscegenation that makes you say I can't marry your sister."
No, I think the other way around. That's the worst. But it's hard to say. Yeah, what you're dealing with is one of the most frustrating elements of Faulkner. All of you who've read it know. We don't know what went on in the parlor Christmas Eve, do we? I mean, all we know is what people think went on and what they said. So Rosa wasn't there. One of the great pleasures of reading this is that the people who are telling us principles are dead. So what went on? Something big went on. Well, what's the relationship? Which was more important? Well, I think the relative importance depends upon who's talking to us, right? For some people, miscegenation is worse than incest, but most for is the man who's the center of this experience to get at his father. And if his father will respond to the fact that he's part black, all right. If his father will respond to the fact that he's his son, all right. But this man is going to stand up and say, I acknowledge you to be my son. That's where Charles is willing to die. That's the alternative. He does die. Result.
He acknowledged Clyde.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant. Right? Right? Clyde's black. She's a servant.
But she's his daughter.
Yeah. But
And
that's
he
not.
acknowledged that.
Yeah, it was. We'll talk about that next week. I hope to think of that. Sure.
But he was very liberal. He was
No,
very.
that's right. And that's a crucial problem legally because he is his legitimate eldest son. Haiti is a black country. Blacks are citizens in Haiti. They're not slaves. Interesting problem for him. Yeah, sure. Yeah, the point is that all of these people have relatively different legal relationships to Thomas Bond or to Thomas Sutpen, don't they? Right? Legitimate children, illegitimate slave, right? Illegitimate, quite acceptable descendant if it's a boy, right? And legitimate but black. So it's an interesting comparison. Faulkner has very carefully structured this novel to give us these conflicting relationships and the consequences of them.
Would the eldest son have first claim over Henry's
Without a will, he would certainly.
primogeniture?
I think the laws of Louisiana have to recognize the laws of any other state, and that he would be legitimately the oldest legitimate son. He could claim it. I don't think.
Even though he had black blood.
I think it's federal law that laws must respect the
And that's
laws of other states, even then. They wouldn't like it, obviously. And remember, it's the whole issue of blackness here is an abstract issue, right? We're not dealing with, except in the case of Clyde and her mother, we're not dealing with black slaves. We're dealing with people who have an eighth or a quarter black blood and are physically no different than anybody here. You see the point? It's a really interesting issue if you get into that. Why people are willing to die over such things. Yeah. The other line in the book, which we'll watch, is Wash Jones, okay, his daughter, Millie, who is simply a conduit, isn't she? She's an available female to breed the next possible generation if he can start over again, the unnamed infant. Okay. Then we have Charles Bond producing his own line. He creates Charles, who's going to put this in? Charles Etienne de Saint-Valery Bond. I like that, don't you? French elegance of that. The only child of Charles Bond and an octoroon mistress whose name is not recorded. You notice what Faulkner refers her to her here as? Not his wife. You see, it's a form of marriage. It wasn't real. And yeah. Okay, he was born in 1859, right? And Charles Etienne Bond chose his black ancestry. He married a black woman. Do this more carefully. Okay. Charles Bond marries an octoroon. He marries Etienne marries a black woman whose name we don't know, and therefore essentially abandons whatever claim he has to being Caucasian, and produces through her Jim Bond, who therefore is minimally 5/8 black, should we say? So mostly black. And at the last on this genealogy sequence, you see Shreve McCannon and Quentin Thompson. Quentin, grandson of Thomas Sutpen's first Yoknapatawpha County friend, born 1891, died 1910, and his roommate, who comes from, doesn't even come from America. So do you wonder that Shreve says, what in the world? Where do you come from? Heaven only knows. It's a good time to talk because I'm going to begin a new segment in a few minutes. So let's take a few minutes break and then get at the opening section. Okay, let's return. I've got sort of two things I want to make sure we do for the second half of this hour. One is to show us a little bit about how Faulkner demands, I always try to tell my kids, it's sort of a higher level perception of the syntax of the narrative. And then I would like to read this opening chapter with you, just kind of read through it with comment here and there, so that you can hear it, because he does read well, and that will, I hope, encourage you to get into the mode and maybe go on and read farther for next week. But let's look at something that is strictly confusing to people when they come to it, and if you don't catch the repetition of the particular pair of words, you miss entirely the high-level narrative syntax, not the sentence syntax, but the structure of the paragraph, of the chapter. So turn to page 21 for a minute. She's talking here. Rosa is talking. And as she does, she's a stream of consciousness talker. She's running on. Poor old Quentin, remember, is 18 years old, ready to go off to college, and he's sitting here, and this aged relic of a past time is trying to make her life valuable or meaningful to a generation for which she's nobody but somebody out there in the woods, essentially. Here she's talking about how he is a fatality, a curse in the South, right? This person who came here like his agent from the devil. Let's take the sentence that begins, so that even I, you see that? 12 lines down. So that even I, a child, still too young to know more than that, though Ellen was my own sister, and Henry and Judith my own nephew and niece, I was not even to go out there save when Papa or my aunt was with me, and that I was not to play with Henry and Judith at all except in the house, not because I was 4 years younger than Judith and 6 years younger than Henry. It wasn't it to me that Ellen turned before she died and said, protect them. Okay, the key word here is protect them. She's trying to claim that, in spite of the fact that she was out of all the action, which she was never there when anything went on. She's asserting to Quentin, well, when the time came, who did she turn to? Right? Even I used to wonder. Okay, but you notice that the protect them is put here in part of a parenthetical insertion, isn't it? I mean, it's not part of the narrative. Even I used to wonder what our father, right? Then you turn over, page 22, and as she has been talking about this fate of the South that has visited her family and so forth, in the middle of this, we come, when she lay dying with one of the children vanished and doomed to be a murderer and the other doomed to be a widow before she had even been a bride, and say, protect her at least save Judith. A child yet whose child's vouchsafed instinct could make that reply which the mature wisdom of her elders apparently could not make. Protect her? From whom? And from what? Well, if you forgot the short line of dialogue in that insertion on the previous page, then you've missed that in the background of the telling of Rosa Caulfield is the continuing scene from her memory of her standing by Judith's bed. And so you have to keep in your head that the word protect is a clue that you're being given an insight into an occasion from 50 years ago, which is not on the tip of her mind, but which is in the back of her mind and yet bringing itself out. And so on page 24, page 25, I do. You tell Marster, yes, from them, from themselves. Now, there's where your mind just totally blanks out. Where did that come from? Well, that's the answer to the question that's asked on page 22. From whom? Protect them? From whom? Protect her from whom? From what? From them. From themselves. Page 27, she continues on talking. And out of nowhere, then a servant came and said our buggy was ready. Yes, from themselves. You see now? Unless you're sensitive to the repetition of the protect from, the key is actually the preposition, isn't it? And then each time, over a span of about 10 pages, she's rummaging in her mind to the answer. Protect who from? Who from? What from? From themselves. From what they're going to do to each other. And if you miss that, there's 5 or 6 items, then you've missed the whole structure of that part of the chapter. It's part of the frustration for new people coming to Faulkner that they don't catch it. And even sophisticated readers
don't realize that he is insisting that you catch the reference to the previous 3 or 4 pages, because all he'll give you is that line from themselves. And yet that is the understructure. One of you was saying it's like a symphony. You have to recognize the motif when it's brought up by a new instrument, and I think that's very apt. That Faulkner writes like this. And so off in the background you hear this like a flute, barely hear it from themselves, from themselves, from themselves. Not from an exterior enemy, obviously, then, but from an interior enemy. And that's where it works. This type of destruction of the normal narrative sequence is typical of Faulkner in his sophisticated novels, and it's why people have a lot of trouble with it. Before we go back to the beginning, I wanted to point out what one of you pointed out, and that is that you can also get a visual sense of Yoknapatawpha County by looking at the map on the next to last page in the book. The sentences here are references to occurrences that occur in a wide variety of novels. And in this book, we have Sutpen's 100, 12 miles out, off this road. Rosa Coldfield's house is right here, as you can see. And you'll see references to many other books here. Here's the church which Thomas Sutpen rode fast to, when the time comes. Here's Sartoris Plantation, from the novel Sartoris. Here's where Reverend Hightowers was when Christmas was killed. That's Hightower's house. That's a reference to Light in August. And you'll see As I Lay Dying, you'll see Sound and the Fury. All these various books are on this map if you want to associate these people with each other in terms of the plot. Okay, let's look at the beginning and do some reading for a while, if that isn't unpleasant to you. From a little after 2 o'clock until almost sundown of the long, still, hot, weary, dead September afternoon, they sat in what Miss Coldfield still called the office, because her father had called it that. A dim, hot, airless room with the blinds all closed and fastened for 43 summers. Because when she was a girl, someone had believed that light and moving air carried heat, and that dark was always cooler, and which, as the sun shone fuller and fuller on that side of the house, became latticed with yellow slashes full of dust motes, which Quentin thought of as being flecks of the dead old dry paint itself blown inward from the scaling blinds as wind might have blown them. Nice beginning, opening sentence. But I think you notice right away how easy that is to listen to compared to how hard it is to read. Something to keep in mind as you plow your way through. One of the low-level psychological effects of this novel is to counterpoint the heat of the summer of the South 50 years ago with the cold of Massachusetts when he and Shreve are sitting in their dormitory room. And it's icy cold, but in his head it's hot, and the sun is filtering through these dust motes in the air. This is Rosa Cold. He's in Rosa Coldfield's office. Why is he there? Does anybody remember? She has summoned him. And what's she going to ask of him? Yeah. Now, the simple structure is she needs somebody to take her out to the old plantation, and before he does it, he has to endure. Right? It's not just, will you please carry my groceries in from the car, right? She's a garrulous old lady who nobody will want to talk to, and he's trapped. He's trapped because he is a gentleman, or a nascent gentleman, isn't he? He's a young man who has to be courteous to little old white ladies, and here she is, rambling on. She's probably not had a chance to tell this story in many, many years.
One of the interesting was that he is familiar with the outline of it. As in a little town, all town history
Sure.
is talked over.
That's right. And in the next chapter, we'll have the words of her recapitulated in a more rational way by his father, who also remembers some of this. I find this quite attractive because my grandma used to talk to me like this. And she used to sit down and tell me all these stories of what went on back in 1885. And I can see both his restiveness, because when I was his age, I didn't want to hear it. And it's only when she died that I realized that I did want to hear it. And so you get this kind of recollection of the past coming. Yeah, very true. Anytime if you have a question like that, I'm willing to very much open up and not turn this simply into a reading, but to talk about what we're seeing in the opening chapter. There was a wisteria vine blooming for the second time that summer on a wooden trellis before one window, into which sparrows came now and then in random gusts, making a dry, vivid, dusty sound before going away. And opposite Quentin, Mrs. Colefield in the eternal black which she had worn for 43 years. Now, whether for sister, father, or not husband, none knew. Sitting so bolt upright in the straight hard chair that was so tall for her that her legs hung straight and rigid as if she had iron shin bones and ankles, clear of the floor, with that air of impotent and static rage like children's feet, and talking in that grim, haggard, amazed voice, until at last listening would renege, and hearing sense self-confound, and the long-dead object of her impotent yet indomitable frustration would appear, as though by outraged recapitulation evoked, quiet, inattentive, and harmless, out of the biting and dreamy and victorious dust. Oh, what a neat. What is she? There's one word, obviously, which symbolizes Rosa Caulfield in that paragraph. What is it? That's a good one, but I'm thinking of another one. Rage, right? This little tiny woman whose feet don't even reach the floor is still infused with rage. So angry that even though and it's very nice because he said that everything in the context of this is genteel and quiet and sleepy and too hot, too warm. But as she sits there with her iron back, all of a sudden these people who ought, my goodness gracious, you read the paragraph and you think, let's let the dead lie, shall we? I mean, nobody she's going to talk about is alive now, and her rage alone recreates out of the past Thomas Sutpen coming in. Emotion can do that, I guess, can it? Certainly if it's powerful enough here. Her voice would not cease, it would just vanish. There would be the dim, coffin-smelling gloom, sweet and oversweet, with the twice-bloomed wisteria against the outer wall by the savage, quiet September sun, impacted, distilled, and hyper-distilled, into which came now and then the loud, cloudy flutter of sparrows like a flat limber stick whipped by an idle boy, and the rank smell of female old flesh long embattled in virginity, while the wan, haggard face watched him above the faint triangle of lace at wrists and throat, and from the too tall chair in which she resembled a crucified child, and the voice not ceasing, but vanishing into, and then out of the long intervals like a stream, a trickle running from patch to patch of dried sand, and the ghost mused with shadowy docility as if it were the voice which he haunted where a more fortunate one would have had a house. That's a sentence too. Qualities I like to notice when I'm reading something like this. Faulkner, it seems as clear to me that he intentionally overdoes the atmosphere here. Everything is extreme, so that it's a gloom sweet and oversweet, right? It's twice gloomed wisteria, not once. Right? Everything has gone on too long, so the air is too sweet to be smelled. It's not the pleasant smell of wisteria, which is nice, but that is cloying. Reminds me of John Keats' poem about To Autumn, right? When everything is, you think long days will never cease, right? The bees have filled up their cells and the honey's dripping on, and it just becomes almost unbearable, the fruit. And this is her case. I mean, she has filled, her emotion has filled this room with too much. It's too much. And there's a ghost there, and the ghost is in her voice, not in her house. Out of quiet thunderclap he would, abrupt, man, horse, demon. Upon a scene peaceful and decorous as a school prize watercolor, faint sulphur reek still in hair clothes and beard, with grouped behind him his band of wild niggers like beasts half tamed to walk upright like men, in attitudes wild and reposed, and manacled among them the French architect with his air grim, haggard, and tatteran. You see that the language is already telling us what somebody noticed, which is that it never changes. It's always Faulkner's voice, even though the sentiments change. But when you're talking from Rosa Caulfield's perception, she can't even find a term to solidify for us his evil, can she? Right? Devil, that man, horse, coming in. His slaves aren't slaves, right? They're monkeys that have been trained. There's this sense of total alienness. Whenever I read it, I think of something like Mephistopheles, right? Coming up from heaven knows where, bringing his myrmidons from hell. Immobile, bearded, and hand palm lifted, the horseman sat. Notice that there's a semicolon there. That's a very short portion of syntax for Faulkner. And in the midst of her intensity and her rage is the image, right, of Thomas Sutpen riding in on his horse with his slaves and his chained French architect and pausing. He's raising his hand to stop them, right? The way you say, whoa. There he is. Behind him, the wild blacks and the captive architect huddled quietly, carrying in bloodless paradox the shovels and picks and axes of peaceful conquest. Then, in the long, unamazed, Quentin seemed to watch them overrun suddenly the 100 square miles of tranquil and astonished earth, and drag house and formal gardens violently out of the soundless nothing, and clap them down like cards upon a table beneath the up palm, immobile and pontific, creating the Sutpen's 100. Be Sutpen's 100, like the olden time, be light. What is Sutpen as she sees him? Yeah, well, the devil, I guess, the city inverse of God, isn't he? But as it's presented, remember, this is Quentin trying to imagine in his mind's eye what this was. Well, she sees him coming and let there be, right? And out of the ground, they rip the plantation out of the ground, don't they? They don't build it. You and I know it took 4 years to build. And even then they hadn't. They bring in cartloads, right, of French tapestries and crystal china. But in Rosa Coldfield, it's all, he is so powerful, this man. Then hearing would reconcile, and he would seem to listen to two separate Quentins now. The Quentin Compson preparing for Harvard in the South, the deep South, dead since 1865, and peopled with garrulous, outraged, baffled ghosts, listening, having to listen to one of the ghosts which had refused to lie still even longer than most had, telling him about old ghost times. And the Quentin Compson, who was still too young to deserve yet to be a ghost, but nevertheless having to be one for all that, since he was born and bred in the deep South, the same as she was. Already, we're only on page 9, already Faulkner is giving us the reasoning that's going on beneath. The very last lines of the novel, very last words. Shreve says to him, as he's trying to Shreve rationalizes this. I mean, well, these are really strange people who live down there with you, aren't they? I mean, goodness gracious, aren't you glad to get out of that place? What a story you've just told me. Why don't you hate the South? I don't hate it, Quentin said quickly, at once, immediately. I don't hate it. I don't hate it, he thought, panting in the cold air, the iron New England dark. I don't hate it. I don't hate it. Well, that's the end of the novel. Of course, within a very few days, he kills himself. He cannot reconcile the two Quentins you see here on page 9, can he? One, the rational, pre-World War I educated man who's going to make something of himself, and what Rosa Coldfield is calling out of his inheritance. Faulkner does not believe you can simply say, as of today, I am now a Northwesterner. I will be a Wisconsin boy as long as I live, unfortunately. Which was very amusing to my colleagues at the U because they thought it made me think cheap and Midwestern and reliable and church-going and all those things. But it's true, isn't it? That's where my blood lies, my family. And a good thing I like Wisconsin. I don't have to say what Quentin Compson has to say. There's no guilt in me because I came from a state which didn't force me to come to terms with this kind of background. And that's why I go to Faulkner for my reading instead of to Hamlin Garland, even though I did my dissertation on Garland. The two separate Quentins, now talking to one another in the long silence of not people in not language. What's he mean by that? Is he communicating in a rational, two minds in language? No. Yeah, but it isn't even separateness, is it? He's not using words. This is what I think you and I would feel, conflicting emotions. That's what he's talking about, isn't it? He's feeling two different ways. He's not thinking two different ways. But the best that comes out is this. And when you're reading this novel, always be aware when he changes typeface into or out of italics, and when he puts a quotation mark there, because you will have long paragraphs which are the specific statements of one of the characters, and the clue is the quotation marks. And you forget it because it all sounds alike. But it does make a difference who's talking. It seems that this demon, his name was Sutpen, Colonel Sutpen. Colonel Sutpen, who came out of nowhere and without warning upon the land with a band of strange niggers and built a plantation. Tore violently a plantation, Miss Rosa Goldfield says. Tore violently, and married her sister Ellen, and begot a son and a daughter which, without gentleness, begot, Miss Rosa Goldfield says. Without gentleness, which should have been the jewels of his pride and the shield and comfort of his old age, only they destroyed him, or something. Or he destroyed them, or something, and died. And died without regret, Miss Rosa Goldfield says, saved by her. Yes, saved by her. And by Quentin Thompson. Yes, and by Quentin Thompson. Can you hear how that refinement, the parenthetical elements are the ones that give that emotional thrust to what Rosa Goldfield is presenting here. If one part of him wants to sort of summarize in a traditional way, well, people come, they live, they die. But they don't, do they? Because they live in an emotional context. And that part of him is sympathizing with Rosa Goldfield. And in fact, she's not the only one who cares, is she? There's part of him that also cares, and he's even now seeing that. Because you are going away to attend the college at Harvard, they tell me, Miss Goldfield said. So I don't imagine you will ever come back here and settle down as a country lawyer in a little town like Jefferson, since northern people have already seen to it that there is little left in the South for a young man. So maybe you will enter the literary profession, as so many southern gentlemen and gentlewomen too are doing now, and maybe someday you will remember this and write about it. You will be married then, I expect, and perhaps your wife will want a new gown or a new chair for the house, and you can write this and submit it to the magazines. Perhaps you will even remember kindly that the old woman who made you spend a whole afternoon sitting indoors and listening while she talked about people and events you were fortunate enough to escape yourself when you wanted to be out among young friends of your own age. Yes, Quentin said. He doesn't say much, does he, in this chat? What do good white boys say? Yes, ma'am. Yes, only she don't mean that. It's because she wants it told. Now, pathos is involved here as well, isn't it? Because you and I know he's not going to have any of these things. Rosa Goldfield, part of her weakness as a person is that she is a stiff-necked Southern lady, if there ever was one, right? And she holds those old Southern standards up as if they were God-given. And in her world, the funny thing about it is that she's not outraged ultimately because of anything Thomas Sutpen did to her sister, or anything he did to his sons, or anything else. What is the outrage that infuses her anger and makes her ridiculous when it's all over? He wants to, yes, he insulted her honor, didn't he? He suggested that, well, why don't we try it, and if you get pregnant, we'll get married, right? To me, a white Southern lady, I beg your pardon. And she's lived in 40 years of rage based on that stupid, right? That stupid, when there's so many other things to be outraged by. She maintains her Southern honor to the end. And of course, she wants it told. It was still early then. He had yet in his pocket the note which he had received by the hand of a small Negro boy just before noon, asking him to call and see her. The quaint, stiffly formal request, which was actually a summons out of another world almost. The queer, archaic sheet of ancient good notepaper written over with the neat, faded, cramped script, which, due to his astonishment at the request from a woman 3 times his age, and which he had known all his life without having exchanged 100 words with her, or perhaps to the fact that he was only 20 years old, he did not recognize as revealing a character cold, implacable, and even ruthless. He obeyed it immediately. By the way, what revealed the character? The note, handwriting. The handwriting alone tells you something, but he didn't know enough about the world to see that, did he? He obeyed it immediately after the noon meal, walking the half-mile between his home and hers through the dry, dusty heat of early September, and so into the house. It, too, was somehow smaller than its actual size. You got that? It was of 2 stories, unpainted and a little shabby, yet with an air, a quality of grim endurance, as though like her it had been created to fit into and complement a world in all ways a little smaller than the one in which it found itself. There in the gloom of the shuttered hallway, whose air was even hotter than outside, as if there were prisoned in it like in a tomb all the suspiration of slow, heat-laden time, which had recurred during the 45 years. The small figure in black, which did not even rustle. The wan triangle of lace at wrists and throat. The dim face looking at him with an expression speculative, urgent, and intent, waited to invite him in. Faulkner has a way of making the air so uncomfortable in his writings. I think it's the beginning of That Evening Sun, the short story where he talks about there's going to be a rise and something horrible is going to happen, but it's been the end of a long heat wave. Do you remember that? And he says the air is like it's been baked underneath a gold brass bowl. The sky is like a brass bowl, covered the town, and the sun has been heating through that. And you read the opening of that story, you just can't endure the heat. That does get like that in Wisconsin, but never in Seattle. And the feeling in the house, what does he imply about the air in the house? As she's been sitting there quietly, unrustling, waiting for him. She's been breathing into this heat for 43 years, right? You walk in and oh my goodness. It's because she wants it told, he thought. So that people whom she will never see and whose names she will never hear and who have never heard her name nor seen her face will read it and know at last why God let us lose the war. That only, through the blood of all our men and the tears of our women, could he stay this demon and efface his name and lineage from the earth. What mistake does Rosa Goldfield make? She thinks that God is there, right, in a providential way, running the entire universe to punish her and her family for its sins. Right? That's the thing. Does she have traditional pride? Yeah, except she isn't worthy of the fall. She's not the tragic hero. But she does certainly see the world in that sense. Yeah? Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah. I think he discovered fairly early on that he had a better opportunity to recreate traditional greatness through his being a Southerner than much earlier than we would ever have thought, and that he knew what he was doing. I think he strove to write for the 20th century what Shakespeare did for the Renaissance, and what the great classic dramatists did for their time. And I think, as horrible as it is, in a literary sense, it's an advantage. I mean, the odds are very low that Washington State will ever produce Faulkner, because you've got to have tragedy to push it. We don't have in our culture the kind of weighed burden of sin. We're still, our Indians are still getting half our salmon, because we're the only part of the country where we still follow the treaties we signed with the Indians. So we have very little guilt in the context of what Faulkner's working with. If you've read any of his stories, stories dealing with Sam Fathers, right, the bear, Faulkner pushes his sense of what we are as a consequence of our past, all the way back through to the Indians who first gave up the land. If you remember, Faulkner says nobody owns the land. I mean, we make an enormous sin of possession when we say, hey, this is mine, I'll sell it to you. And the Indians share in the sin. And the whites share, and the blacks share it too. It goes all around. It's a human weakness. But he had the region. As a writer, he had it. Our best writers are still going to be writers of really nice little poems about fishing in trout streams. That's the best the Northwest so far has produced, really. Kind of a curious, which is very good, right? But it's not Oedipus Rex. And the nice thing about Faulkner is that when he's working, he's doing that for you. He's creating that feeling that, this is where great human passions come together. Then almost immediately he decided that neither was this the reason why she had sent the note. And sending it, why to him, since if she had merely wanted it told, written, and even printed, she would not have needed to call in anybody. A woman who, even in his Quentin's father's youth, had already established herself as the town's and country's poetess laureate by issuing to the stern and meager subscription list of the county newspaper poems, ode, eulogy, and epitaph, out of some bitter and implacable reserve of defeat. It would be 3 hours yet before he would learn why she had sent for him, because part of it, the first part of it, Quentin already knew. It was a part of his 20 years' heritage of breathing the same air and hearing his father talk about man Sutpen. a part of the town's, Jefferson's, 80 years heritage of the same air which the man himself had breathed between this September afternoon in 1909 and that Sunday morning in June in 1833, when he first rode into town, of no discernible past, and acquired his land no one knew how, and built his house, his mansion, apparently out of nothing, and married Ellen Coldfield, and begot his 2 children, the son who widowed the daughter who had not yet been a bride, and so accomplished his allotted course to his violent. Miss Coldfield at least would have said, just end. Quentin had grown up with that. One of the features of Faulkner and of this novel that I hope you are sensitive to is that he shares with All the King's Men, Robert Penn Warren's novel, a very clear sense that history is not something, life is not something which divides itself up into neat, discrete units that you can separate them and put them in separate boxes. And over here is the box that deals with the Civil War. And if you're interested, you can go to that box and open it up, because as you catch from this very nice passage I just read, something happens in June of 1833 that causes the boy to commit suicide in winter of 1910. Right? That is, there are connections. And if you read All the King's Men by Penn Warren, you know that that whole novel is structured around a very interesting symbol of life being a spider web. Remember the image? And Warren says there are all these interconnections, and over here, right, is a spider, and we're over here, so far away, but the twang of something in that spider web 35 years ago is going to cause somebody's death 35 years from now, because all these things interrelate. Nothing does its thing by itself. It's an interesting concept, and I think Faulkner is reminding us of this by that juxtaposition of these lines, this September afternoon in 1909, and that Sunday morning in June 1833. You would think 76 years would be long enough, wouldn't you? Not long enough. Not in human history, it's not. And here, obviously, is the beginning of the presentation of information which is just going to befuddle you until you read farther. Right? That is, what can it possibly mean? He begot his 2 children, the son who widowed the daughter who had not yet been a bride. Well, that doesn't mean anything on page 11. It's only after you've read the story and then reread the story that you understand what Henry did to prevent Judith from marrying Charles Bond. Quentin had grown up with that. The mere names were interchangeable and almost myriad. His childhood was full of them. His very body was an empty hall, echoing with sonorous, defeated names. He was not a being, an entity. He was a commonwealth. He was a barracks filled with stubborn, back-looking ghosts, still recovering, even 43 years afterward, from the fever which had cured the disease, waking from the fever without even knowing that it had been the fever itself which they had fought against, and not the sickness, looking with stubborn recalcitrance backward beyond the fever and into the disease, with actual regret, weak from the fever, yet free of the disease, and not even aware that the freedom was that of impotence. "But why tell me about it?" he said to his father that evening when he returned home, after she had dismissed him at last with his promise to return for her in the buggy. "Why tell me about it? What is it to me that the land of the earth, or whatever it was, got tired of him at last and turned and destroyed him? What if it destroyed her family too? It's going to turn and destroy us all someday, whether our name happens to be Sutpen or Coldfield or not." Is that true, by the way? Sure. I mean, I'm sure we're all going to find our time. And one of the features of his father is that he gives to this story that is so immediate and real to Rosa Coldfield a sense of adult perspective. Because Quentin suffers from something that I encounter all the time. Adolescence over-response, emotional over-response, failure of perspective. You tell something to Quentin and it sits inside of him, and all these people stay there. And Mr. Coldfield, or Mr. Thompson is able to say, well, sure, I know these stories, but what is the point of them now? Right? He sees the equivalence of human experience, whereas Rosa Coldfield sees only the extreme value of the individual experience, which happens to be her own. That's one reason why they make such a nice pair talking about this. "Ah," Mr. Thompson said, "years ago, we in the South made our women into ladies. Then the war came and made the ladies into ghosts. Well, so what else can we do being gentlemen but listen to them being ghosts? Then he said, do you want to know the real reason why she chose you? They were sitting on the gallery after supper, waiting for the time Miss Goldfield had set for Quentin to call for her. Now, this is the second visit, right, in one day. He's already been there in the afternoon, gone home to get the buggy, gone back again. He's going to take her out to see the house. It's because she will need someone to go with her, a man, a gentleman, yet one still young enough to do what she wants, do it the way she wants it done. And she chose you because your grandfather was the nearest thing to a friend Sutpen ever had in this country, and she probably believes that Sutpen may have told your grandfather something about himself and her, about that engagement which did not engage, that troth which failed to plight. Might even have told your grandfather the reason why at the last she refused to marry him. And that your grandfather might have told me, and I might have told you. And so, in a sense, the affair, no matter what happens out there tonight, will still be in the family. The skeleton, if it be a skeleton, still in the closet. She may believe that if it hadn't been for your grandfather's friendship, Sutpen could never have got a foothold here, and that if he had not got that foothold, he could not have married Ellen. So maybe she considers you partly responsible through heredity for what happened to her and her family through him. Interesting reasoning as you kind of pursue Mr. Thompson's perspective of what's going on in the mind of the old lady. Why does she want to go out there? Does anybody know? Have they read far enough? How did they? Ghosts in the house. Is there anybody in the? Yeah, somebody's in the house. We had thought that it was that all these people were dead and gone, weren't they? But it turns out that there are living remnants still there, and she has heard about it, and she wants to go out and see what's there. Does anybody know who's out there? And? Why Henry? What's he been doing out there? Hiding because? Yeah. How many years? Yeah. 40 years Henry's been out there hiding because he's a murderer. A fate no man deserves. Somebody else is out there too. Who's that? Jim Bond is out there living on the plantation. Whatever her reason for choosing him, whether it was that or not, the getting to it, Quentin thought, was taking a long time. Meanwhile, as though in inverse ratio to the vanishing voice, the invoked ghost of the man whom she could neither forgive nor revenge herself upon began to assume a quality almost of solidity, permanence, itself circumambient and enclosed by its effluvium of hell, its aura of unregeneration. It mused, thought, seemed to possess sentience as if, though dispossessed of the peace, who was impervious anyhow to fatigue, which she inclined to give it, it was still irrevocably outside the scope of her hurt or her harm. Whenever it's Rosa Goldfield talking about Thomas Sutpen, you start getting these great big words. You know, they're words that have almost a tactile effect if you read them out loud. Effluvium. You can just see that. Sometimes I think it's like reading a seance when they're creating something made out of what's ectoplasm. I get that feeling of it. The big words, solidity, effluvium, unregeneration, right? That the sounds themselves create this ghost. She can't hurt him, but she can interfere with his sleep, can't she? She can call his memory up and hate him, which is nice. It's the only thing she can do. And this paragraph reminds you of what must have been her tremendous frustration after it's all. There's no way for her to pay him back, right? She gets insulted by this guy, and he's invulnerable to her. Her standards mean nothing to him, and that's why her rage has lasted so long. If I could remember what Ahab says, if the sun attacks me, I can attack the sun, right? I can go right. I have at least that ability as a man to stand up and fight back, and that's why he chooses the whale. He says, "I'm tired of what the universe has done to me, and I'm not going to take it anymore." So he is a great heroic character. Rosa Goldfield does not have that, see. She doesn't have the ability to face and implant in some phenomenon her enemy. All she has is a memory of that enemy, and therefore she's totally frustrated in her anger. It's just a diffuse rage. With that quality peaceful and now harmless, and not even very attentive. The ogre shape, which, as Miss Goldfield's voice went on, resolved out of itself, Before Quentin's eyes, the two half-ogre children, the three of them forming a shadowy background for the fourth one. This was the mother, the dead sister, Ellen. This Niobe without tears, who had conceived to the demon in a kind of nightmare, who even while alive had moved but without life, and grieved but without weeping, who now had an air of tranquil and unwitting desolation, not as if she had either outlived the others or had died first, but as if she had never lived at all. Quentin seemed to see them, the four of them arranged into the conventional family group of the period, with formal and lifeless decorum. And seen now as the fading and ancient photograph itself would have been seen enlarged and hung on the wall behind and above the voice, and of whose presence there the voice's owner was not even aware, as if she, Miss Coldfield, had never seen this room before. A picture, a group which even to Quentin had a quality strange, contradictory, bizarre. Not quite comprehensible, not even to 20 quite right. A group, the last member of which had been dead 25 years and the first 50 evoked now out of the airless gloom of a dead house between